This encounter was sent in by John and Stephanie from North Carolina. It takes place in Owl Creek, in the far western region of North Carolina, in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The surrounding topography consists of both mountains with tall peaks, as well as gently rolling hills. At the time of the encounter, they had been camping in this area yearly for 5 years. After years of keeping the story quiet and sharing it with very few people, they've decided to share it with us. Stephanie and John had been married about a year when the encounter happened, although they had dated for close to 7 years before getting married. Both were currently working as teachers, but at different schools in the same district. Each of them had a close friend at their respective school, and together, Stephanie and John thought that their 2 friends would be a great fit for each other. In fact, they had been trying desperately to get the 2 of them together, thinking it would be fun if they could all hang out. But after months of trying to get them all together on double dates or other outings, they had finally decided to give up. Timing just hadn't been on their side. But then came summertime and Stephanie had a great idea. School was out, and so she suggested to John that the 4 of them go camping for a weekend. John agreed, thinking that it would be a great opportunity for them to all spend some time together without the distraction of other things. So, they invited their 2 friends, Brad and Emily, along with them on their yearly camping trip. As luck would have it, they were both free and excited to join. So, plans were made for the foursome to head off in June to the mountains of North Carolina. June finally came and they all headed out. The first night, they ate around the campfire and shared stories. It was an instant success. Brad and Emily hit it off and were getting along great. They even seemed to be comfortable sitting next to each other and helping each other out at the campfire making food. Talk was easy and relaxed, and at one point they were all even attempting to scare each other with creepy stories about creatures in the woods. Bigfoot, werewolf, all the usual creatures. Of course, no one believed the stories, but all still agreed that it was hard to not look over your shoulder at the slightest sound now that these thoughts were in their minds. They had all become just a bit jumpy at this point. Anyway, they all enjoyed a quick camping dinner of skillet chicken and potatoes before Brad suggested they walk a bit through the woods to work off the food and get it moving along inside them, as he said. So after dinner, they all decided to walk a bit. But as they were walking, Emily began to hear strange noises. At first, she told herself it couldn't be real, and her mind was still stuck on the creepy stories from earlier. Plus, she would later say she didn't want to look like the odd one out by saying anything out loud to anyone. So, she kept her mouth shut. She told herself that the noises were just some normal animals in the woods, but then the noises became louder and more human-like. At that point, the noises became unmistakable, and unmistakably weird. You couldn't ignore them, and that's when all 4 of them stopped and looked at each other. They were all totally freaked out by the strange sounds. Stephanie said that it was obvious how they each felt by the looks on their faces. Then John, who knew the area a bit from his past trips here with Stephanie, shone his flashlight in the direction of the noise, but saw nothing. Yet at the same time, Emily jumped as she thought she saw the reflection of eyes looking back at them. But then as fast as she saw them, they went away. Even though only Emily thought she saw something, they all later said that they had the same feeling that something seemed to be getting closer to them. So after a few minutes of looking around, John suggested they go back. And that's when he told everyone that he planned to set up his trail cam so that if anything did materialize, he would have it on camera, and they would at least know what they had been hearing, even if they were asleep. The group then went back together to their campsite and set up the trail cam. However, when they got back to the site and looked around, they said it strangely felt that things around the campsite had been moved. Nothing really obvious, but for example, Stephanie, though, she had left her backpack in a different location than she found it, and John was sure he had opened a beer, but could only find cans that hadn't been opened. This only served to add to the feeling that something was out there with them, and made them all even a little bit more on edge. So after John set up the trail cam, everyone tried to get some sleep. John and Stephanie were together in their tent, and Brad and Emily each had their own individual tents. Later that night, as Emily was lying in her tent trying to get to sleep, she heard a branch snap nearby. It seemed like a larger branch, but she figured it was just one of the other campers walking to the bathroom or something. But then she heard another strange noise, and this time it sounded like it was right outside her tent. She sat up to look, slightly unzippered her tent slowly as to not make any noise, and saw a large, dark, furry creature standing just beyond the campfire, looking right in at her. She immediately screamed, which alerted the others, and they all scrambled out of their tents and over to her. But by the time they got to her tent and listened to what she said, the creature was gone. They all speculated what it could have been, describing normal animals like a bear, a coyote, etc. But of course, no one could give a definite answer. They didn't see it. At this point, it was about midnight, and they were all jumping at even the slightest noise. But what happened next would shake them to their core. As they were all standing there discussing what Emily might have seen and trying to calm her down, they heard a loud hissing from the woods. It almost sounded human. They all immediately went silent as they realized that there was something out there, and it wasn't just a normal forest animal. John said he was going to go check it out because the noise was just too human to ignore, and Brad offered to go over with him. The two of them took their flashlights and headed into the woods. After a few minutes of walking, they heard a growling noise, but this time it sounded like it was right in front of them, almost so near that they could touch it. They stopped and shined their lights around them in a circle, but still couldn't see anything. Just as they were about to give up, John saw what looked like two red eyes shining in the darkness, and then he heard the loudest growl he'd ever heard in his life coming from whatever creature belonged to those eyes. Before he could yell out, the creature was rushing towards him. He yelled for Brad, and they both started running back towards the camp and towards the girls with the creature following him. The guys both came rushing back into camp, only to see Emily with her phone up, trying to film whatever was happening. She had heard them screaming and heard them rushing back. The guys entered the camp with the beast close behind. When the creature saw that Emily was holding up her phone, it seemed to understand what she was doing and flew into a rage and started chasing after John again. John screamed for Emily to stop filming and just run, to get out of the creature's territory. Everyone should just leave everything and run. The guys grabbed the girls and started running. Emily was screaming the whole time, yelling out loud that they were leaving and to just leave them alone. They only made it a few hundred yards before they heard the creature give up the chase, and they stopped. They all stood there, panting, trying to catch their breath as they realized just how lucky they were that nothing bad happened. From where they stood, they could see back to their campsite, and there, at the far side, they could see the creature watching them from the woods, in the same location that Emily had originally seen it. It wasn't until then that they were able to get a good look at it and realized just how big the creature actually was. Standing upright, it must have been at least 10 feet tall, with long, furry arms and legs. And as they stared at the creature, it stared back at them with its bright red eyes, before turning and disappearing into the darkness of the woods. The four of them then abandoned their things and headed back to the car, not saying a word to each other the entire way. They all just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible, and that's where their story ends. No crazy big ending, no nice and neat conclusion. It just ends with them getting away with their lives, which is something that they are more than thankful for, and their hopes that sharing this all with you may save another life in the future. Stay safe, everyone. Hey everyone, imagine you're alone in the wilderness when suddenly the sounds of nature are replaced by a suffocating quiet. Every twig snap echoes in the unnatural stillness, prickling your skin with unease. You know that this is not a peaceful solitude. It's the hush of a predator approaching. And then you look around, and a flicker of red pierces through the trees, and you know that something is very, very wrong. Well, that's what happened to our next story, and you won't believe what happens. So tie your laces tight and get ready to run if you need to, because this one is a doozy. The scorching July sun beat down on Yellowstone National Park, like a giant blacksmith hammering on the ground. The heat baked the earth and shimmered the air, making the distant mountains look blurry. Sweat dripped down my forehead, making it hard to see anything clearly. The usual sounds of nature in the park were replaced by an eerie silence, heavy and thick, that made me feel on edge. This silence was different. It made me jumpy, like something was watching me, waiting to pounce. Every rustle in the bushes and every snap of a twig sent shivers down my spine. Then I saw a flash of red out of the corner of my eye, like a bright red bird flitting between the trees. I froze, my heart pounding like a drum solo in my chest. I squinted through the shimmering heat, but I saw nothing but a wall of pine trees swaying in the breeze. Must be the heat messing with my eyes, I thought, wiping the sweat out of my stinging eyes. But then the red flash came back. This time, the red was deeper and pulsed faintly, like a dying ember refusing to go out. Curiosity gnawed at me, even though I was getting more and more scared. I left the marked trail and pushed through the thick bushes. Branches scratched at my clothes, and the air smelled strongly of pine needles and dirt. The red light grew brighter, pulsing with a weird rhythm, pulling me deeper into the woods. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No birds chirping, no insects buzzing. Everything was silent, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to mess up. The ground became soft and squishy under my boots when I finally emerged from the bushes into a clearing bathed in an unearthly red glow. 3 glowing red balls floated in the air, casting an eerie light on everything around them. They looked like nothing I'd ever seen before. No wings, no body, no comforting hum of an engine. These were silent, the only sound coming from their red glow that seemed to pulse in my bones. Pure terror flooded through me. I froze, stuck in place like a deer caught in headlights. My hand instinctively reached for the radio on my hip, but what could I say? Report UFOs? They'd laugh me out of the park. So I stood there, a silent witness in a scene straight out of a nightmare. The silence stretched on, broken only by the pulsing of the red spheres. My brain raced, trying to come up with a normal explanation, but coming up with nothing. Then, things got even weirder. The air crackled with a low hum, making the hairs on my arms stand on end. The red spheres started to spin, faster and faster, their glow getting brighter until the clearing seemed to be bathed in blood. Suddenly, a beam of pure white light shot out of one of the spheres, heading straight for me. A scream ripped from my throat as I threw myself to the ground, squeezing my eyes shut and burying my face in the dirt. The white light bathed me for what felt like forever. Then, just as abruptly as it appeared, the light vanished. Silence. A deafening silence that pressed down on me like a heavy weight. I lay there, trembling, until my heart calmed down a bit. Slowly, I opened one eye. The clearing was bathed in the soft light of dusk, the red spheres gone without a trace. Disoriented and shaken, I got to my feet. The encounter had drained all my energy, leaving me weak and wobbly. As I stumbled back towards the trail, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through me. Reaching the familiar path, I practically ran back to my station. The image of the red spheres and the blinding white light burned into my memory. The next day, the clearing was empty. No sign of the strange lights, no scorch marks on the ground, nothing to explain what I'd seen, except for one creepy detail. A single pine tree stood in the center of the clearing, its normally bright green needles now a sickly shade of gray, dead, a stark reminder of the encounter, a silent guard in the heart of the forest. The Wildlife Service blew off my report, saying the dead tree was struck by lightning. Maybe they were right. Maybe there's a normal explanation for everything I saw. But every time I patrol that section of the forest, a shiver runs down my spine. The memory of the encounter replays in my mind with perfect clarity. The heavy silence, the pulsing red spheres, the blinding white light, and most disturbing of all, a new detail I only noticed later, a faint, rhythmic ticking sound coming from deep within my pocket watch, a watch that had been inexplicably still for years. Now, the ticking never stops, a constant reminder of the night. What were those lights? What did they want? And what lingering effect do they have on me? That's really the scariest part of all, wondering if I'm somehow changed. The answers, it seems, are lost, though. A mystery buried deep. However, the ticking of my watch is a creepy and constant reminder of what happened, and now it serves as the only clue to the night I encountered the unknown. I was interning at a small newspaper one summer while I was still finishing up my degree in journalism. The internship I landed was in this tiny town in Vermont, but internships were hard to get, and I needed the experience, so I took it. The first month was horrifically boring. I wrote fluff pieces about apple festivals and parades and charity car washes. I knew that I wouldn't get anything particularly hard-hitting in such a small town, but I was hoping for at least one good story before I left. Unfortunately, it took a tragedy to get that one good story. 2 hikers had gone missing one weekend, while out in a state forest not far from town. Apparently, it did happen from time to time, given that the area was so wild and undeveloped, and many people were completely unprepared for the conditions. Although usually these issues were related to sudden bad weather, this was mid-July. There had been no storms in the last several weeks. The prevailing theory was that they had left the trail and got very lost or had possibly fallen. There were the normal search and rescue attempts from the local organizations, and some volunteer search parties were organized. I was sent out to do a human interest piece on the group that planned and supported the volunteer search efforts. I met them in a parking lot by the trail and interviewed a bunch of people. It was cool to see the process and how hard they worked to pull it all together. I was also hoping to hear some news firsthand. Even though it was way above the call of duty to participate in the search, I joined them on their next sweep. I figured it would add a little something extra to my story. Plus, it didn't feel right to just be standing around while everyone else was working so hard. I tagged along with a group of 4 locals who were heading into the woods. They had a whole coordinate system that I didn't understand, so I just followed along, making notes and keeping an eye out for the hikers. I could see firsthand how hard this was going to be. The park was absolutely massive, and the woods were thick and confusing. There were steep ravines everywhere, so the hikers could easily have tumbled off of one and might never be found. An hour in, we found a clue, and I was ecstatic that I had come along. Our group found a backpack on the ground way off the trail. There wasn't anything identifying in it, but it looked like it hadn't been out there very long, so it was a solid bet that it belonged to the couple. The search leader called it in and got more volunteers to fan the area, since it was likely they would be close to where we found the bag. A little while later, we found 2 hiking poles and started to get worried. We were hoping it wasn't a horrific injury. Rescue wouldn't be able to get to that section for hours, and no one wanted to wait in case someone was still alive but badly hurt. So, we kept going. We searched the area closely, assuming they may not have gotten too far. We did find a few more items like a water bottle, a sweatshirt, and a cell phone and tufts of fur, like they had been in a fight with a wild animal, but no actual people. It was weird. After we completely canvassed that area, we spread out even more. Soon things took a turn for the weird. That's when we saw the prints. Giant footprints, barefoot, huge, and oddly shaped like a human foot. We followed them for a while until they ended abruptly. They just stopped dead in the woods, without explanation. We hushed ourselves into complete silence, solemnly exploring the area, resigned to the fact that something awful had probably happened, and we might not be able to find out exactly what. Just then, we all heard a faint yell. We all started yelling back, and after searching a few minutes, we located the missing hikers. To everyone's surprise, they were curled up in a tree, clutching a thick tree branch, looking terrified. They were both traumatized and looked dehydrated. As we waited for rescue, some of the volunteers tried to talk to them to see what had happened. They didn't say much, but the man just kept muttering something. Finally, we asked him to say it slowly and clearly. That's when we heard it. He was saying "dog man." It was a dog man, over and over. We thought he was delirious, but then I thought about the weird footprints and the strange fur. But at that point in time, I kept my thoughts to myself. After the police and rescue teams arrived and got the two of them down, the man started talking a little more, hysterically describing the half-man, half-dog that they had seen in the woods that had terrified and chased them. He said it was huge and human-shaped, but covered in fur. They had been so terrified that they dropped everything and ran, but they kept feeling the presence of the creature looming behind them, and so decided to climb the tree, hoping it couldn't and wouldn't follow. Luckily, the man described watching the creature stop in its tracks, sniff at the air for a bit, and then spin around and run in the opposite direction. Back at the office, I had a choice to make. It was risky, but I chose to write the entire experience as honestly as I could. I described the scene and what the man had said, word for word. I didn't make any claims, but my story was pretty clear. The paper wouldn't print it and threatened me not to give my written account to anyone, so in the end I put it on Reddit, but changed the location and waited for comments to come in. Turns out lots of other people have had similar experiences and encounters, even if they didn't have to hide in a tree to survive. As for that town in Vermont, the official story was an unnamed animal attack, but I can attest to the fact that there are officials in that town who know the truth. They're just not talking about it. A few months back, I bought myself a drone. I'm a videographer for events like sports, weddings, birthdays, anything of that nature. I figured I could use the drone footage in the videos I made for people. I even got my drone license, which you need if you're going to use the footage for commercial use. I started going around the town and got footage of the neighborhood around my house, office buildings, the local school, whatever I could get. Plus, it was also good practice to get an idea how to use it, how far it can go, and all that. The idea of getting all that footage was so I could have some footage ready for whatever assignment might need it. And I always loved those big, epic shots you see in movies. One of my friends suggested flying the drone from a trail you can drive along with your car. The trail has a beautiful panoramic view of the city. I agreed that that would be the perfect place to get some footage. The GoPro I had at the time recorded pretty good night footage too, so I was planning on getting some night shots as well. One weekend, she and I headed up there to get the shots. We were there from about noon until it got dark. I had an app on my phone that streamed the drone's footage. That way I could see what was happening and maneuver it better. My friend would hold the phone, and I would handle the drone, but I did let her fly it around a little bit to get acquainted with it. It had gotten dark, and my friend was handling the drone while I was holding the phone so she could see where she was going. We were talking about how to best maneuver it when she squinted her eyes and said she could see someone in the tree line far below us. I looked at the phone and was surprised to see she was right. It looked like a man wandering far off the trail. We looked at each other and wondered what he was doing down there. From what we could tell, he was huge. In those days, you couldn't go too far with my drone without it losing its signal, so she didn't try to go out too far and get a better look. I asked her for the drone remote, but by the time I grabbed it, the figure was gone. We started making random stories to explain the guy. Maybe he was a hermit. Maybe he was some guy lost or someone living in the woods. We made plans to go again the next weekend to get more footage of the mountain. some other shots of the town, whatever interesting angles we could get. A part of me hoped we would see that huge guy again. I wanted to see what he was up to. The next weekend rolled around, and we headed to the trail again. This time we went further along the trail to get a better view of the woods below. Same time of day as last week, from noon to nighttime. Sure enough, about an hour after it got dark, we saw the strange figure again. We had a bit more range in the drone this time, so we began to track his path. Whenever he started to get out of range, we would drive a bit farther along the trail. We followed him all the way to a dead end. My friend asked if we could bring the drone closer to the man. I figured why not give it a shot. I had it hover and move slowly along the tree line below. At this point, we had lost sight of him, and we needed to squint to make anything out. After about 10 minutes of searching, we found him. He was hunched over, deeply involved in something on the ground. The picture quality wasn't the best, but he looked like he was naked. The drone hovered around him for a bit. He didn't move or anything. I tried to get a bit closer when he suddenly flinched and stood up. We were not looking at a human, and the creature was way bigger than we previously thought. He stared down at the camera as it hovered below his head. It was pretty dark, but the feed on my phone showed something sort of like an ape, but built more like a weightlifter or bodybuilder, but totally covered in hair. The more my friend and I looked at it, the more we were convinced it wasn't a man. The creature grabbed a nearby rock and threw it at the drone with such force that it brought it down. When it hit the forest floor, the feed cut out completely. We heard a scream, not a man's sound, but more primal, like the sound you would hear from apes, along with stomping noises. Next, we heard the sound of footsteps, like heavy thuds. Then they quickly disappeared. I had no intention of heading into the woods in the dark, especially knowing that this thing was out there. We decided instead to head home and try to retrieve the drone the next day when it was light. The next day, we returned, and while hiking through the woods, there was an awful smell in the air. It was distant, but distinct. After some time, we did find the drone, which had been completely destroyed. The SD card was broken, and every part of it was smashed to bits. I'm sure that no one would have believed what we saw anyway, even if we had footage of it. The footage we had taken was pretty grainy, so we never saw the animal clearly, but we could tell that it was unlike any other animal we had ever seen, even if we felt our footage was proof of a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot. Most people would have written it off as a man, or even a mutant forest animal. I've thought the same thing, but the sounds we heard were not sounds that humans could easily replicate. We never bothered telling people about it, but we knew what we saw, a huge, hairy figure that towered, even among the trees. It was definitely not a man, but try telling anyone that. Most people would assume that what we saw was a bear, and that our eyes had played tricks on us thinking it was larger than it really was. But what really convinced us was when we found the drone. The drone had been completely smashed into the dirt. All around it were footprints, huge footprints. The prints were similar to a man's, but longer and wider than any foot I've ever seen. We know what we saw. Since that day, I've been saving up money, hoping that the creature didn't take off to another forest, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I will get clear footage of it someday.